Hey everyone, welcome back to the Phoenix's Tale. I am your host Gabe, and we are continuing on with Chamber of Secrets, and this week discussing Chapter 14, Cornelius Fudge. However, before we get to the recap, let's talk about why this episode, as well as the next few on the schedule, are late. As you may know from my previous episodes, I've been dealing with untreated PTSD for nearly 13 years now. And sometimes that means that my plans get derailed very quickly. Triggers hit, my energy tanks, and yesterday's momentum turns into today's paralysis. Pushing through, I have learned over the years, is not about willpower alone when you're fighting your own nervous system like this. I've also learned that pushing too hard damages my already compromised wiring, my nervous system. But all I can do is keep working to find balance between the two, progress on my goals, and rest for healing without one of them wrecking the other one. And here is what has actually kept me going over the last 3 years since this podcast crystallized in my mind. And that is that when I can create, whether it's episodes for the podcast here or social media content, it does feel better at the end of the day. And that's on top of the fact that this is the first plan for me to get back on my feet in any way feels right to me. So I will definitely continue doing my best to keep going no matter how many times I get off track. That is the one thing that I am promising not only you, but myself with all of this. As a matter of fact, let me take a moment real quick to talk about something that I have been putting together and got a late start on that as well. And this for me has to do with my effort to find tools that I need to help myself better through all of this. And I call it my Great Lock-In series. That's going to be on TikTok. I will be cross-posting all of those posts here to the YouTube channel as well, where I'm going to be spending the rest of the year testing different somatic tools to add to my toolbox. As it were, to regulate my nervous system and to release trauma, at least until I can properly access therapy. Feel free to check it out. It should be up within the next couple days. Yes, like I said, I'm late on getting that going as well, but I've got a plan to get caught up by this weekend. It is currently February 10th, a Tuesday, as I'm recording this, so hopefully by end of day Saturday, Valentine's Day, I will have that caught up, as well as some more podcast episodes for you that should have been posted back in December. So, like I said, feel free to check it out. Join me if you like. I will be catching up on everything. Like I said, hopefully by the end of this week. So, in case you haven't caught on with all of this, healing is very messy. I'm not going to lie. It just, some days I feel like just such a complete mess through all this. But here's the proof that we just need to keep rising anyway, which is what I plan on doing. So let's dive in. For our recap, this is the day after Harry had seen Tom Riddle's memories about the Chamber of Secrets 50 years earlier, and he tells Ron and Hermione what he'd seen, and they discuss the idea that perhaps Hagrid is innocent. The second years are now looking at which courses to add to their schedules, starting in their third year. Harry and Ron end up signing up for Care of Magical Creatures and Divination, while Hermione signs up for everything. Typical Hermione. Sometime later, it's discovered that someone stole the diary, and Hermione surmises, due to the circumstances in which Harry and Ron figure this out, it could have only been a fellow Gryffindor. So that really kind of narrows things down a lot for this mystery. Then it's time for the next Quidditch match, Gryffindor versus Hufflepuff. And just as the Golden Trio heads down to the pitch, Harry hears the voice again. When Hermione this time finally realizes what's going on, and she runs off to the library. And just as both teams are about to start playing, Professor McGonagall runs out of the castle, announces that the match is canceled because of another attack, a double attack. Hermione and Penelope Clearwater. She's that Ravenclaw 6th-year prefect that Ron and Harry saw on their way down to the Slytherin common room, disguised via Polyjuice as Crabbe and Goyle. Determined to solve this mystery, Ron and Harry sneak down to Hagrid's in the invisibility cloak for a chat, and while they're there, Cornelius, Fudge, Lucius Malfoy, and Professor Dumbledore arrive at Hagrid's cabin. Thankfully, Ron and Harry are under the invisibility cloak, and the net result of this meeting is that Hagrid is being sent to Azkaban because of what happened 50 years ago, and Dumbledore has been fired as headmaster by the Board of Governors of Hogwarts. So this week, and this is quite fitting actually, now that I think about it, this week we're going to take a break from the serious stuff for a minute, even though I opened this talking about my own struggles with mental health recently and why I'm behind on some of the things I want to do. So we're not going to be talking so much about that or any of the psychological stuff. I thought we'd talk a bit about why Chamber of Secrets is my least favorite book in this series. I asked my favorite ChatGPT tool for some issues that it could find from other readers who feel the same way I do about this particular book. And I'll expand on some of them and invite you to share your thoughts. I can't wait to read the comments on that one. So, some of the reasons that the fans dislike Chamber of Secrets. The first one is that there are too many plot conveniences throughout this story. Readers often mention that the story relies heavily on convenient coincidences and solutions, such as the pipes being large enough for the basilisk or the polyjuice potion subplot not impacting the central mystery much. Now, I do agree with this assessment a bit, but to me, this is typical given the fact that I feel this book to still be in that young reader category, along with the Sorcerer's Stone, whereas, and you'll see this in another month or so when we get into The Prisoner of Azkaban, that her writing gets more intricate the more mature Harry and Ron and Hermione become, and it starts becoming for a more mature audience, I feel like, by extension. So, as for the pipes being large enough for a basilisk, I don't know if this is canon, but I have seen online that the reason for that is that the plumbing had to be magical as well. I mean, this is Hogwarts, for crying out loud. A lot of talk that Hogwarts is semi-sentient, and we'll get into some of those issues later on as to why. But the pipes magically expand and contract as needed. So, there's really no need for plumbers in Hogwarts because nothing is going to get stuck. You don't have to have a plumber come out and fix things. So, as for the polyjuice potion, however, while it wasn't what they had hoped, the Golden Trio do at least get some clarity on the entire mystery, which ultimately changed direction for them and helped them figure everything out by the time we get to the end of the book, which we're going to get into in the next couple chapters. Another reason that a lot of readers find Chamber of Secrets to be their least favorite is because it feels very derivative of the Sorcerer's Stone. Many fans feel the second book repeats the formula of the first, with another secret hidden within the school, a magical object at its center, and a final confrontation underground, resulting in less novelty and surprise. And this one I wholeheartedly agree on. I haven't been able to put it into words, but given the primary reason I love Prisoner of Azkaban so much, and there's an aspect to that derivative of Sorcerer's Stone that I did not see pop up in my research, but it's a problem that I personally have. And it's, for me, it's the fact that Harry does not come face to face with Voldemort in Prisoner of Azkaban. He comes face to face with Voldemort again at the end of Chamber of Secrets, and I remember getting to this part in the overall story with all 7 books that we don't need to see a final confrontation between Harry and Voldemort throughout the entire series. There's so much more to it than that. And we'll dive into that more specifically when we get into Prisoner of Azkaban. But this is another reason I dislike the book, because to me, under this category, its derivative of Sorcerer's Stone is because, okay, is this how every single book's going to end? Harry versus Voldemort until Harry finally kills Voldemort at the end? Anyway, a lot of people feel like the darker tone feels out of place, with the overall atmosphere being much darker, much more menacing than the first book, which some readers feel clashes with the otherwise juvenile moments and the humor, creating a tone that feels uneven for an early entry into the season, or into the series. And I actually disagree with this one. Although I do understand how others can feel like this, I take the series in its entirety when considering the darker tone of this book compared to Sorcerer's Stone, and for me it fits. It's like slowly easing yourself into a pool of cold water. I'm not one to just cannonball into cold water like that. I have to ease myself in and get used to it, and that's kind of what I feel like the darker tone throughout the whole series takes from beginning to end. So I feel that Chamber of Secrets, yes, is a bit darker than Sorcerer's Stone was, but adequately so as we continue moving through the series. A lot of people complain about the reduced wow factor. The novelty of Hogwarts and the magical world isn't as strong, since much of what was new and exciting in book 1 is now familiar. For some, this makes the plot feel less magical and immersive. And again, I don't agree with that, but I do see how others can feel like that. When the books were new to me, I was always excited to return to Hogwarts with each book when they came out beyond Chamber of Secrets, because this was actually the first book I read before going back to the Sorcerer's Stone. I don't know if I've told this story before, so I'm just going to recap it quite easily. There was one day, Chamber of Secrets was new, and of course my mom and I were at Costco, and they had a whole stack of Chamber of Secrets books, and I love my mother, but she doesn't pay attention to things. And for some reason, she seemed to think that this book was written by a 13-year-old girl. Like I said, I think she got some things mixed up when she was hearing about this. So we went ahead and grabbed the book, and it was through reading Chamber of Secrets first. I'm thinking, wait a minute, there's got to be a first book to this. So I go to the very beginning where it lists all the books that the author has written. And indeed, oh, there's Sorcerer's Stone right there. So we had to go back to get Sorcerer's Stone, not Costco. We had to go to Barnes and Noble at that point. But so that's kind of how things got mixed up for me. So I actually read Chamber of Secrets first, and I was like, okay, this is kind of cool and exciting, but to me, I still prefer Sorcerer's Stone over Chamber of Secrets, because it really, seeing it from Harry's perspective made it so much more fun for me. But on the whole, I don't really agree with this, because there are some new aspects to this, such as, we find out about Floo powder, and we find out about the Whomping Willow, and we learn about house elves and that there are such creatures as house elves. Dobby's made an appearance a couple times now in this book. So there was still some new things unfolding for Harry as well as the rest of us as we're reading along through the book. So I kind of disagree on this one. The only bummer of it was that once we did get Sorcerer's Stone and I was completely caught up, had to wait a whole year for Prisoner of Azkaban. So that was a bit frustrating, to say the least. Another reason people struggle with Chamber of Secrets is for the unnecessary or drawn-out subplots. The Polyjuice Potion arc, for example, is cited as a red herring that doesn't contribute to the resolution, and it eats up story time, making the pacing feel slower and more meandering. And again, I disagree with this when we consider that Harry and Ron learned from Malfoy, or what Harry and Ron learned from Malfoy during the Polyjuice chapter. Had they not gotten that much, they wouldn't have known that the chamber had been opened before and that a student had died at the time. And they didn't know the timing of this, but they got some clues along the way, where at the same time we know that Harry and Malfoy were not responsible, because Harry and Ron obviously suspected Draco this whole time, and the whole school, after the failed dueling club with Professor Lockhart and Professor Snape, realized that Harry speaks Parselmouth, etc., etc. So at least now Harry knows for sure that he's not doing anything he's unaware of with all of this. The questionable logic or world building is another reason people don't like Chamber of Secrets so much. They find some of the world building choices odd, such as Nocturne Alley being accessible to children, or elements like Hogwarts staff not investigating the chamber more thoroughly when it's reopened. That's an excellent point, and I do agree with those in general. However, now that we know the entire story, most of us know the entire story beginning to end, I would argue that Harry was allowed because of that connection between him and Voldemort. Remember a few chapters back when Hagrid found Harry in Nocturne Alley and took him back to Gringotts and the Weasleys, Ron mentioned that they had never been allowed in, and that's why I think in this book, at any rate, that Harry was allowed in. Another reason many dislike this book is that there is weak or stagnant character development. There's criticism that character growth is limited compared to the other books, and the secondary characters outside of Professor Lockhart and Dobby don't get much depth or advancement in this installment. And quite simply, I agree. We don't see a lot of character development from the Golden Trio and their fellow second years with the older students, Percy, Fred and George, anybody on the Gryffindor Quidditch team. Not a lot of character development on this one. Another reason is that this is a less engaging mystery than the Sorcerer's Stone. While the heir of Slytherin and the Basilisk plot are important, some readers prefer the mysteries or emotional complexity found in the later books. And it feels like to them that this installment falls short in these areas. And again, I agree with this one. However, in the scope of the entire series, we will learn that this is a key story. Okay? Those who are familiar with the series know this, so I am not going to give any spoilers for those of you who haven't read the books yet or even seen the movies, but we don't talk about the movies here because I think they're utter garbage compared to the books. So, and I mentioned this at the beginning. For me, Chamber of Secrets is still in that young adult category. And her writing starts becoming more complex, more intricate, more in-depth as Harry ages throughout this series. And I do often wonder, I haven't heard anything to the contrary yet, but I do often wonder if that was a choice by J.K. Rowling to do that. If it was utterly brilliant, I believe. If not, it was a happy accident, because that's what I love so much about the books, is just how detailed they start becoming once we get through Prisoner of Azkaban, but we really get going into Goblet of Fire through the rest of the series as far as the detail and the intricacy and how all of these pieces come together. I mean, there were clues in both Sorcerer's Stone and here in Chamber of Secrets that are going to play out big time at the end. So for those of you who are not familiar with the story and happen to be reading along with me as I'm doing this podcast, no spoilers, but it's going to be awesome. So now I want to talk about Fawkes a bit, because we didn't dig into the significance of that as it applies to this podcast. At least we haven't yet. We're going to now. There's a reason why I named this podcast The Phoenix's Tale. So let's dive into that. Bit of education here. Phoenixes are mythical birds known for their powerful symbolism of rebirth, immortality, and renewal. In folklore and mythology across various cultures, a phoenix is said to live for hundreds of years before bursting into flames and being consumed by fire, only to rise again from its own ashes as a young bird. We saw this a couple chapters back when, after Justin Fletchley and Nearly Headless Nick were attacked, and Professor McGonagall takes Harry up to Dumbledore's office for a little chat, we see Fawkes burst into flame and become a pile of ash. This cycle of death and resurrection makes the phoenix a potent emblem of transformation and hope. Phoenixes are often associated with purity, healing, and protection. For instance, their tears are said to have healing properties, and their song or presence can inspire courage and renewal. Again, this is something we are going to see with Fawkes and Harry specifically throughout the rest of the series. They symbolize endurance and the triumph of life over destruction, making them especially meaningful in narratives involving overcoming adversity. In the Harry Potter series, Fawkes the Phoenix embodies these traits by aiding Dumbledore and Harry at critical moments, such as saving Harry from the Basilisk, sorry about the spoiler there, and providing healing tears. No more details on that. Fawkes represents not just magical power, but also hope, loyalty, and the possibility of new beginnings even in the darkest of times. So how does this apply to my life? How it applies as of late is that I feel as though I am in the midst of a rebirth cycle. Specifically that my life, metaphorically, right now is that pile of ash. Over the last couple of years, I have been feeling the beginnings of rebirth sparking here and there. and liken it to what is happening to that pile of ash. On the outside, we're not seeing any change. I haven't seen a lot of change in my life over the last many, many years, as it were. On the inside, however, those sparks of rebirth, metaphorically speaking, are beginning to happen. I've mentioned several times what my life is currently. Okay, no job for over a decade, no car, living with my aging mother, etc. I have been fighting to get back on my feet financially for over 11 of the last 12 and a half years. Yet, I have been feeling like I'm still slipping lower and lower into the abyss of rock bottom, or rock bottom's basement, basically, this entire time. So I am desperately awaiting the rebirth to begin, the outward appearances that everybody else is going to see. However, as I just mentioned, this pile of ash of a phoenix state that I am currently in is starting to shift. Going back to how I opened this episode and some of the things that have been happening and why I got off track. Yes, my PTSD had been triggered a bit. And I have just been struggling a lot over the last couple months. Just keeping my head above water. Starting this podcast last year is one such thing that I have done, and given the current state of things in my life, I am more than ready now for those sparks of rebirth to start showing on the outside. But what does rebirth mean to me beyond just starting over? How do I envision my life post rebirth? And those were questions that the ChatGPT tool asked me when helping me research this episode. So basically, as you might imagine, based on what I just said, I need to completely rebuild my life at this point. But what rebirth means to me is building a life of my choosing, because I have felt as though everything I have done for all 54 years I have been alive was based on others' expectations instead of my own. Some of the things I envisioned for myself more recently with this rebuild and this rebirth are moving back home to California, getting myself a car, having finally my reconstructive surgeries, getting the tummy tuck and doing something with my arms and my legs, dealing with the loose skin after 2 major weight losses, and having a baby, even though that baby's going to be 28 next month. Being able to wear certain clothes, finding a sweet little dog somewhere who needs me as much as I need him. I have been imagining this dog with the pup distribution system. We've heard of the cat distribution system. With the pup distribution system, there's a pup coming into my life over the next 2 or 3 years who will need me as much as I need him. Slow, lazy days of working on content creation for my social media. This podcast becoming more popular as I can hopefully continue doing the work that I need to do on social media to drive traffic, etc. Going to the beach with my pup after he finds me and just having a lot of fun playing on the beach. Basically being myself. Now that I have a much better idea of who I am and what it is that I want. I do also see myself earning a PhD and building a nonprofit of some kind, and definitely a lot more travel. So basically a calm, peaceful, zen life with the right people around me for me. Platonic, romantic, possibly professional, business, a collaboration of some kind, but the right people for me. And I've been giving this a lot of thought, so it is quite detailed in my mind, and I'm going to do my best while still struggling with this PTSD. Oh, speaking of which, starting proper therapy. Yes, my series, my Great Lock-In series that I have developed and need to get caught up on, because we should have started February 1st, is one such way that I am helping myself in the meantime until I can get into therapy. But therapy is still my goal for that. And that is going to be the first, maybe the second thing that I pay for myself. The first will be a 2-week trip home to California to just be for 2 weeks on my own. I'm not bringing any family with me. It's just going to be me. But I desperately need to be home in California for a couple weeks. So ChatGPT also asked me, what internal changes or sparks am I noticing that others might not see yet? I thought this was a great question. So, I am certainly very well aware now of who I am and what that means, specifically being autistic. I've been learning a lot about what that means and seeing it, seeing my childhood now through that new lens and realizing, oh, okay, this makes complete sense now, is because I'm autistic, not because I'm like an alien just visiting Earth, looking like a human, which is how I felt like I felt throughout my entire childhood. I have been finding in recent years that my mind seems to be working better when it comes to being creative with working around those triggers when they do happen. I'm finding it easier to find those triggers and doing what I can to feel better. One such trigger I had, for example, was realizing that the doom scrolling I was doing nearly every single day, not getting anything done beyond the very basics, and wasting days and days and days and weeks and months consuming news, current event, political content. And it really came to a head for me Labor Day weekend 2025. And I decided the easiest way to combat this was to unfollow every single political content creator that I was following at the time on TikTok and here on YouTube. I've unfollowed all of them. And thankfully, my life has been a lot calmer since then, to the point where these efforts to get back on my feet, these efforts to get caught up with the podcast and some of the other things that I want to do have been a lot easier for me. I'm also more willing to give something a go if it captures my interest, specifically in what I can do to monetize all this without sticking it to my listeners. Which is one of the reasons why this podcast is on YouTube and it is not behind a paywall. I know how frustrating it is when you don't have a lot of resources, whether it's financial resources, whether it's having a car to get to a therapy appointment, I know how it feels. And I have navigated several gaps in the market, as it were, for ways that we should be able to help other people who are stuck and need the help. Not to say that, there's an ego involved here. There isn't. It's just recognizing that I have gained a lot of help, a lot of insight into myself, onto my circumstances, by finding those people on social media whose stories resonate with me. And I want to give that back to everybody else now that I am in a position to occasionally I'll get caught up, I swear, to occasionally sit down and record a podcast episode and start sharing my story. How I managed to keep my head above water and just all of these things. Our stories can be powerful for other people who need to hear them. There, I'll leave it with that. So the next question ChatGPT asked is, how can embracing the metaphor of the phoenix help me feel more hopeful or empowered during times of hardship? I found this to be quite an interesting question, actually. I think that in seeing myself as a phoenix at this point helps me keep reality in front of me. And what I mean by that is thinking back to the idea of my life currently being that pile of ash, following an intense burn cycle. I can define what that means for me, which is pretty much everything in the previous question, or my answer to that previous question, and how I envision my life and what I want it to be moving forward. But what that means for me in the real world, thus keeping my frustrations over things not happening fast enough, and other such frustrations, keeping those frustrations at bay, given where I am in the constant lifestyle of a phoenix. This is not going to be the first time, but I do believe this was the most intense. So I cannot wait to see what this particular rising phoenix is going to accomplish and going to do for herself. I'm very excited about that. ChatGPT then asked, what lessons have I learned from the past decade that could serve as the foundation for this new chapter? I have learned that I am a badass. And I say that without ego. I say that as objectively as I can. I know what I have been through. How long it has been since the initial trauma event. What I have done and or endured over the last 12 and a half years, and everything I have learned about myself in that time. The most important for me is being autistic, and how the more I learn what it means from other autistics, it explains everything that was once so confusing to me about myself. As for the foundation moving forward, I'm honoring my autistic traits, and I want whoa. Sometimes my notes, I just got to question myself with my notes here. As for the foundation moving forward, I am honoring my autistic traits and what I want without causing harm to anybody else. There it is. In what ways am I tending to my pile of ash state? What am I doing to nurture growth, even if results aren't visible yet? I really don't have a question or an answer to that one yet. I'm doing the best I can. Thankfully, I have found something that when I do get to do it, it helps me feel better. Almost like a therapy session. All I can say to answer that question is I'm doing the best I can at this point. Maybe I can flesh that one out a little bit more in another episode once I've sat with that one for a while. The next question, what fears or doubts emerge when I think about the rebirth process, and how can I address or reframe them? Oof. Okay. Transparency time. I must admit that in diving into what it means to be autistic and revisiting what I remember from my childhood, to see those things in a new light has actually been amazing for me. However, I do think that this mental block I have with the social media side of things, and I've discussed that a few times on this podcast so far, that all has to do with what I believed of myself back then, specific to my father's verbally abusive ways. And I'm worried that I'll do even more damage if I should rise too high with everything. In other words, becoming a lot more popular with my content, both on social media and this podcast, than I am currently envisioning. And only to have another trauma of some kind just slap me down so hard that I will never recover. I mean, this recovery period has lasted over 12 years. It will be 13 years officially in just 3 short months. My trauma event happened in May of 2012. Not 2012, 2013. I can't do math all of a sudden. And I don't want to fall further down than what I have been this time around in Rock Bottom's basement. Because for me, Rock Bottom's basement has been fucking enormous. Almost like, where's there a wall that I can even find a door to get out of this fucking place? If that makes sense. How can sharing my personal story of ashes to sparks inspire or comfort others facing their own challenges? This is what I was trying to allude to earlier. So, just sit with me for a second. So, this is specific for any of you out there who are in similar circumstances as I am. You haven't had a job or any source of solid, sustainable income for a very long time. Living with people who aren't so supportive where you need it. Not having a car. Having lots of plans that you want for yourself while fighting your own mental health, fighting your own brain, and being socially isolated. All I hope is that you don't feel alone in this. I know that I have found several content creators on TikTok whose content has helped me feel a sense of connection with someone who understands some aspects of my current life. And I want that for any of you, and the only way I can do that is to share my story. So if it resonates, amazing. I hope it does. If it doesn't, keep looking. You will find those other content creators whose stories do resonate with you. And to even get just a glimmer of a thought. I had an incident a couple years ago when I first joined TikTok. I found somebody whose personal story specific to the PTSD resonated so hard with me, more so than anybody else's had. And it was a moment of clarity for me in knowing that even though I'm never going to meet this person and have a conversation with them, if I did, I know they at least would understand. Whereas I don't feel like I'm getting that here, which has been a lot of the behind the scenes issues with why I am struggling so much with staying consistent with all of this. Okay, I feel like I don't get the emotional support I need. And don't underestimate how powerful that can be, especially for those of you out there who are, for some reason, socially isolated, regardless of how you got socially isolated, whether it was, a product of the circumstances or if it was a decision of your own. I had a very good episode a while back talking about that. The social isolation and the difference between embracing it and doing what you can to learn more about yourself and what you want your life to look like. And because for me, as somebody who's autistic and carrying PTSD and carrying complex PTSD from my childhood, my mind is very loud all the time. And it complicates things having people around who don't get me. Because even as a child, isolation is where I felt safe. Solitude is where I felt safe. Being shut up in my bedroom, I don't have to hear my mom, I don't have to hear my dad, I don't have to hear my stupid brothers, I don't have to hear the TV, isolation for me was safe. So I have been embracing that for the last 8 years by choice. And there is a huge difference between choosing to embrace social isolation and getting the healing that you need and whatever else you need versus a forced isolation. That's where things can get really bad. But I've already done an episode on that. My point of this is, because I'm rolling into 45 minutes here as I'm looking at the timer on my camera. You do what you can, and you connect as best as you can, even if it's just watching their content, can be highly valuable for you in that. I don't mean to cut off things so quickly, but I've got a few more notes here that I got to get through. So, what small victories or milestones will I celebrate as signs that the rebirth is underway? Easy. Earning money consistently. Doesn't have to be a lot, because $200-$300 a month for several months in a row is still consistent. But just earning money consistently to start, no matter the amount at first. Like I said, getting myself a new car, getting my own cell phone plan, thus saving my mother, who is paying for all 4 cell phones right now, saving her some money, and start pulling back on some of that financial responsibility for myself. Being able to take that first solo trip home to California for a visit for 2 weeks. Paying off my student loans. Being able to buy birthday and Christmas gifts for my family. Being able to do the small things for myself, like number 1 on the list, going to therapy. Having my nails done again. Going and having pedicures done again. Maybe even going to the tanning salon again. I would like to get a good pair of running shoes, because I would very much like to get back into running. At my age, I don't dare do that with my older shoes, because, things happen if you keep running on shoes that have more than about 300 or 400 miles on them. Things like that. The little things at the beginning are going to be the things that I am going to be able to celebrate, and that I will celebrate. So how does this metaphor connect with my podcast's mission or purpose? So what message do I want to convey to my listeners through this? The primary message that I want to convey to every single one of you out there is that you are worth it. You did not deserve what happened to you. You must do what is best for you, and for you to share your story. That is where healing begins. I have been finding throughout the course of this podcast, as inconsistent as I have been with it, battling my own mental health, that some stories lose their power the more you are comfortable sharing them. Telling that first person about any abuse that you've endured is nerve-wracking. But the more you tell it, the more the perpetrator's grip on you loosens, to the point where I can sit down and have any conversation you want, for the most part, about anything I remember from growing up with a verbally abusive father in a very matter-of-fact tone. It's because I've worked through it. I have shared my story. I held no shame over something that my father should be ashamed of. I was just a kid. Most of you out there were just kids. Most of you out there going through something that happened somewhere in the middle of your life, like my trauma event did almost 13 years ago. We don't deserve that. We didn't deserve that. None of that was our fault. And every single one of us is worthy of being happy and healthy and whole and live our life the way we want. Every single one of us. And that's how, specifically telling your story, that's how we heal. That's how we rebuild. And that's how we connect with others. So many of us waste time blaming ourselves. And I am just as guilty as this as everybody else. We blame ourselves for things that we didn't do and bowing down to those who have hurt us. And I, for one, am so fucking tired of it. I am so goddamn tired of it. Anyway, on that note, my apologies. This episode did actually get a little deeper than I expected. Despite what I said at the beginning. But, you know, when I start doing research and I get stuck and I turn to my chat GPT-esque tool called perplexity.ai, highly recommend it. It comes up with some interesting questions that I want to integrate. So, you know, that's what we did this time. Anyway, on that note, we're going to wrap things up for the week. Next week, actually in a couple days, because I got to get caught up here, we will be back with a more serious talk with Chapter 15, Aragog. Until then, find a way to have some fun this week, however you define it for yourself. That's the goal. Just have some fun. I'll see you next time.